The students at Georgetown University weren't just here for a lecture, they were here for a show. Professor Richard Klein, a man who had built his reputation by tearing faith apart with cold, surgical logic, was about to do it again. He had faced believers before. He had crushed their arguments before. And tonight, he had a new target, Barron Trump. But what Klein didn't know was that this time, the debate wouldn't go as planned. The lecture hall at Georgetown University buzzed with anticipation. Rows of students filled the seats, some leaning forward with interest, others tapping away on their laptops. The evening seminar, titled Faith Versus Reason, the Modern Dilemma, was a highlight of the philosophy department. And at the front of the room, standing with an air of quiet confidence, was Professor Richard Klein. Klein was a force on campus. More than just a professor, he was a provocateur, a master of debate who had spent years dismantling religious arguments with surgical precision. He didn't just teach philosophy. He performed it. And tonight, like many nights before, his performance was about to begin. He stepped forward, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit, his sharp eyes scanning the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, deliberate, "we live in an era of unprecedented scientific advancement. Medicine, technology, artificial intelligence, humanity has unlocked wonders once thought impossible. And yet," he let the silence hang for effect. "Despite all of this, people still cling to the idea of a divine being watching over them. Tell me, why?" A few students chuckled. Others nodded, already familiar with where this was going. "The question I pose is simple," Klein continued, pacing now. "If there is a God, a benevolent, all-powerful God, then why does suffering exist? Why do children die of disease? Why do disasters wipe out entire communities? Why does a so-called loving deity sit idly by while the world burns?" More murmurs. Some students scribbled notes, while others simply watched, waiting for the inevitable back and forth. Klein always invited debate, but few dared to challenge him. He thrived on these moments, dismantling religious convictions with ruthless logic. Then, his gaze landed on someone near the back of the room. Barron Trump. A handful of students turned to look. Barron was tall, composed, and not particularly outspoken in class. Though recognizable due to his last name, he rarely drew attention to himself. He was polite, reserved, a stark contrast to his father's brash demeanor. And yet, in this moment, something about him piqued Klein's interest. "You," Klein said, his smirk widening. "Barron Trump, you've been quiet tonight. Tell me, do you believe in God?" The room stilled. A few students exchanged glances, intrigued. Barron didn't flinch. He met Klein's gaze with an expression unreadable, his posture relaxed. "I do." Klein chuckled. "Fascinating. Perhaps you can help me then. If God is real, why doesn't he stop bad things from happening? Why does he allow suffering?" The trap was set. Klein had asked this question dozens of times before, and the responses were always the same: stammering, vague appeals to faith, desperate attempts to rationalize the irrational. But Barron didn't rush to answer. He simply sat there, calm. The silence stretched, a few students shifting in their seats. Klein raised an eyebrow. "No answer?" he prodded, tapping his fingers on the podium. "That's what I thought." Barron leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the desk. "I never said I didn't have an answer," he said, his voice even. "I just don't think you're asking the right question." A flicker of something crossed Klein's face. Mild surprise. He recovered quickly. "Oh? Enlighten me." Barron exhaled slowly. You keep asking why God allows suffering, but what you're really asking is why He doesn't stop it. Why doesn't He intervene and fix everything for us? Klein clapped his hands together. Exactly! Now we're getting somewhere. Let's say I see someone standing on a train track, and a train is speeding toward them. I have the power to stop it, but I don't. Wouldn't that make me a monster? More chuckles rippled through the room. Klein's grin widened. This was where most religious students stumbled. But Barron remained unshaken. "Are you saying we're all tied to train tracks?" he asked. Klein smirked. "Metaphorically, yes." Barron shook his head. "That's a loaded example. If someone is about to be hit by a train, stopping them is the clear moral choice, because they're powerless. But life isn't that simple, is it? People have free will. If God stepped in every time something went wrong, we wouldn't have free will. We'd be puppets." Klein chuckled. "Ah, free will. The classic escape route." Some students laughed, but others hesitated. There was something different about this exchange. Klein took a step closer. "Fine, let's follow that logic. If a child gets sick and dies, is that just free will? If a man loses his wife in an accident, should he just shrug and say, 'Oh well, God didn't want to interfere'?" Barron exhaled, like he had expected that argument. "That's not what I said. You're mixing up human choices with suffering. Some things happen because of people's decisions. Violence, injustice, greed. Other things, like illness or accidents, remind us that life is fragile." Klein pounced. "Exactly. Fragile, random, chaotic. Just like the universe. No divine plan. Just chance." Barron studied him for a moment. Then, with measured calm, he asked, "Then why does anything good happen at all?" The room fell quiet. "You keep asking why bad things happen," Barron continued, "but let's flip the question. Why do people love? Why do they forgive? Why do they sacrifice for others? If the world is just chaos, why do we fight for something better?" Klein opened his mouth, but for the first time he hesitated. For years, his debates had followed a pattern. The student fumbled, he delivered the final blow, the class applauded. But tonight, the rhythm was off. The expected outcome wasn't playing out. Still, he wasn't ready to let go of control. "You're dodging the point," Klein said, crossing his arms. "You're talking about love and sacrifice as if they prove anything. But those things don't need God. Humans are social creatures. We evolved to care about each other for survival." Barron nodded. "All right, let's test that idea. If everything we feel, love, kindness, selflessness, is just chemicals in our brains, what happens when someone chooses to ignore that wiring? When they choose to be selfish? To hurt others, just because they can?" Klein smirked. "Then we call them immoral." "But why?" Barron pressed. "If morality is just a human invention, then someone who kills for fun is no different from someone who feeds the hungry. They're both just following their instincts, right?" A few students frowned. This wasn't the direction they had expected. Klein scoffed. "That's a false comparison. Societies create morality because it benefits the group. We punish murder because it destabilizes the community." "So morality is just whatever works for the majority?" Barron asked. "More or less." Barron let the words hang in the air for a moment before he asked, "Then was slavery moral when the majority supported it?" Silence. Klein's expression hardened. "That's not what I said." "But it's what your argument suggests," Barron said, his voice steady. "If morality is just decided by the majority, then slavery, segregation, even genocide were right at some point, simply because people accepted them. Is that what you believe? The discomfort in the room was palpable. Klein exhaled sharply. Morality evolves as societies grow more enlightened. What was acceptable in the past isn't acceptable now because we've progressed. Barron nodded. And what makes that progression possible? If right and wrong are just human-made ideas, why do we instinctively feel that some things are wrong no matter how many people accept them? Why do we look back at history and feel disgusted, even when those actions were considered normal then? Klein opened his mouth, then shut it again. Barron's voice remained calm. We recognize evil, not because society tells us to, but because there's something deeper, something beyond culture or biology. The room was dead silent. Klein's grip on the podium tightened. Barron leaned forward. Professor, do you love anyone? Klein frowned. What? Do you love anyone? Barron repeated. Klein hesitated. The question had caught him off guard. His debates were always centered on cold logic, on dismantling faith with reason, not on personal matters. And yet, now all eyes were on him, waiting for an answer. He let out a small, almost scoffing breath. Of course I do. What kind of question is that? Barron nodded, his expression unreadable. Then, prove it. Klein's brow furrowed. Excuse me? Prove that you love them, Barron said, his voice steady. Measure it. Weigh it. Put it under a microscope. Show us scientific proof of love. A low murmur rippled through the class. A few students leaned in, intrigued. Others glanced at each other, as if realizing where this was going. Klein scoffed. That's ridiculous. Love isn't something you can just put in a test tube. It's a human experience, something we feel. Exactly, Barron said. You can't see it. You can't hold it. But you know it's real because you experience it. And that's why I believe in God. Not because I can prove him under a microscope, but because I see him in the world, in the way people love, in the way they forgive, in the way they sacrifice for others when they don't have to. Silence. The usual rhythm of Klein's debates, his confident challenges, the fumbling responses, the triumphant final blow, was completely broken. Jessica, one of the sharpest students in the class, and typically an enthusiastic supporter of Klein's arguments, spoke up, her voice quieter than usual. I have a question. Klein turned to her. Go ahead. She hesitated. You said love is a human experience, something we feel but can't prove scientifically. Doesn't that mean there are some things beyond just logic? Beyond just what we can measure? A few students shifted in their seats. Klein exhaled, gripping the podium slightly tighter. That's not the same, he insisted, but there was less force behind his words now. Barron looked at Jessica. Have you ever lost someone? She blinked. Yeah, my grandfather last year. Did that loss change you? Jessica frowned slightly. What do you mean? I mean, did it make you see things differently? Did it make you cherish people more? Appreciate time more? Jessica didn't answer immediately. Then, after a pause, she nodded. I guess, yeah. Barron leaned forward. Suffering isn't meaningless just because we don't like it. Hard times change us. Pain forces us to see what matters. It teaches us to love better, to live better. If God stopped all suffering, we wouldn't learn those things. Klein let out a dry laugh, but it lacked his usual confidence. So your argument is that suffering is good for us? Barron shook his head. Number suffering is awful. Nobody wants it. But if we only judge God by whether he prevents pain, we're missing the bigger picture. Klein raised an eyebrow. And what bigger picture is that? Barron exhaled. Look at history. The people who changed the world the most weren't the ones who had easy lives. They were the ones who suffered, who lost something, who had every reason to give up, but didn't. Martin Luther King Jr. suffered. Harriet Tubman suffered. Viktor Frankl survived the Holocaust. Corrie ten Boom lost her entire family in a concentration camp. But they didn't let their suffering define them. They used it to fight for something greater. More silence. Even the students who had laughed earlier were no longer smirking. If God stopped every bad thing from happening, Barron continued, we'd never know courage. We'd never know sacrifice. We'd never understand love in its fullest form, because real love is choosing to care, even when it hurts. Klein pressed his hands against the podium, gripping the edges. His voice was quieter now. So what? We're just supposed to accept suffering? No, Barron said simply. We're supposed to fight against it, to bring good out of it, to be the hands and feet of the God we claim to believe in. That's the difference. Jessica swallowed hard. Other students looked at Barron differently now, not as someone naive or blind in faith, but as someone who had made them think. For the first time in one of Klein's famous debates, the momentum had shifted. The usual laughter, the smug grins, gone. Klein's confidence, so unwavering at the start, had dimmed just enough for everyone to notice. He let out a slow breath, then pushed away from the podium, pacing slightly. "All right, Barron," he said, his voice softer than before. "Let's say I grant you that suffering can have meaning. That doesn't prove God exists. It just means people are resilient." Barron studied him for a moment. Then, after a long pause, he asked, "Professor, do you love anyone?" Klein frowned. "What? Do you love anyone?" Barron repeated. "A family member? A friend? Anyone?" The room was deathly silent. Klein hesitated. He had spent his career discussing abstract philosophy, but suddenly the conversation had turned uncomfortably personal. Finally, after a long pause, he gave a small shrug. "Sure, of course." Barron nodded. "Then prove it." A few students in the back murmured. Klein let out a dry laugh. "What? Prove that I love someone?" "Yes," Barron said. "Show me love under a microscope. Put it in a test tube. Weigh it. Measure it. Define it using scientific data alone." Klein crossed his arms. "That's ridiculous." "Is it?" Barron asked. "You just admitted love exists, but you can't prove it scientifically. You can't see it. You can't hold it. Yet you know it's real because you experience it." The class remained frozen, locked into every word. "And that's exactly why I believe in God," Barron continued. "I see him in the same way we see love, not through a microscope, but in the way it changes people. I see it in the mother who forgives the man who killed her son. I see it in the doctor who spends his life saving strangers. I see it in every person who chooses to do good, even when they don't have to." Klein's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Jessica blinked, looking down at her notebook, her pen frozen in her hand. A student near the back swallowed hard. Someone else shifted in their seat, arms crossed, eyes distant in thought. The air felt different now. Klein exhaled, letting his hands drop to his sides. He looked at Barron for a long moment. "So that's your answer," he said finally. His voice was quieter now. "You believe because you see good in the world." Barron nodded. "I believe because I see a reason to." A long silence followed. For the first time, Klein had no comeback. And then the bell rang. The sharp chime echoed through the lecture hall, but no one moved. Usually, students packed up quickly, eager to escape. But tonight, they sat frozen, as if breaking the silence would shatter something unspoken in the air. Klein glanced at the clock, then back at Barron. He cleared his throat. "All right, class." His voice lacked its usual bite. "That's all for today." Still, no one rushed out. Some exchanged glances. Jessica hesitated before closing her notebook, her expression unreadable. Others sat quietly, lost in thought. Barron finally stood, gathering his books, as if nothing had happened. He didn't look like someone who had just shaken the foundation of a man who built his career on challenging faith. Klein watched him. He didn't stop him, didn't throw out one last retort. Instead, he simply said, "I'll see you next class." Barron nodded. "See you then, Professor."